I was super excited when I was like, Anitra's going to be a podcast. Oh, that's great. Because there's not too many people that have a career progression where they have business analysis in their background. And then not only do they have Agile coach / Scrum master, but then they're in product. And I'm like, this is everything that I wish to talk about in mind. All my dreams have come true.
So my mission comes down to, I want to change the way we work. And all the steps throughout my career have kind of been leading toward that mission. And even beforehand, a lot of my training, my education, all kind of goes into it as well. So my undergraduate degree was actually in anthropology, archaeology. Again, very, very different than IT. Mm-hmm. But what I found by understanding more about just people over time, what's common about humanity, what's common about cultures, different cultures in different areas over time. It's really helped me understand more about just better ways to work. So again, undergraduate degree, totally different. I was self-taught in technology. I did go on to get an MBA. That really helped me also understand just businesses, how they work, the language they speak. And of course, I've gotten various certifications over the years, again, kind of continuing with the training and the education. But the common thread for me throughout all of this has really been around user experience and agility, kind of that discovery and really human-centeredness of it.
That's fantastic. It's interesting you say that your degree was not in IT or technology, because I've met so many people who are now in the Agile space that don't have technical background, right? And
I was going to say,
knocking it out of the park.
Yeah, most people that I've interacted with, their degree is not in. I think I'm one of the only people whose degree actually is in information technology of some way, shape, or form. Yeah. Other than the few people that I've met that are computer science majors, and then they're just from another planet.
Yeah, and I've had technical jobs. I mean, one of my earlier jobs was working I was a front-end web developer, designer, but again, that was so far back in the day that I was self-taught, and that was perfectly sufficient. This was back when websites were still fairly new, more brochures than interactive, and it was much easier to teach yourself back then how to do these things. So again, I was doing the technology work, and it was interesting because it took me a little while, but I did figure out what that common thread was between what my love of technology is and my love of like the past, of humanity, archaeology. And for me, it was that sense of newness, that sense of discovery, of eureka. There's always something new when it comes to technology, or there's new ways of applying technology. Whereas with like archaeology, you're always uncovering new things about the past, or understanding new things about people, about groups of people in the past. So again, that was another little common thread I found why I was, so fired up about both technology and humans and ancient humans and just, as I said, that common thread running throughout my career.
I think that's amazing because most successful Agilists have had backgrounds, at least by training anyway, in those kinds of areas as opposed to just pure technology. It's funny, I was having a conversation with someone not too long ago around how do we use our degrees? That was the topic of the conversation, right? And he's like, well, I never used my degree. I don't know if that's true, really. When you think about it, you think about what you do day in, day out. You may not be wiring hardware if you have a hardware degree, as I do. Hardware, hardly anybody does that these days. It's robotics, right? But somebody has to design the robots and somebody has to program them. So this is kind of interesting to me because at that discussion, it turns out that they started with, no, we don't use our degrees. His degree was in geography. And he's been exploring all his life, right? Yeah. Even while he's in the Agile space, he's doing that. New way of working and discovering new things.
Yeah, and cultures, company cultures, trying to navigate them. My cultural anthropology classes really prepared me to understand it, to not judge companies, to try to understand them where they're coming from at the place where they are right now. Again, all sorts of things that I use on a regular basis that I never would have thought I would use it in that way, but it just turned to work out that way.
Culture is coming more and more into the discussions these days. It wasn't always the case 20 years ago, let's say, or before that. People didn't care about cultures. It was just an organization. You go, you work until the day you retire, you collect your gold watch.
Yeah. Well,
look at it now.
It always should have been in the conversation when you're talking about it. Like any company is just a system. You know what I mean? And like if you, oh boy, I'm jumping ahead 2 podcasts. If you are not directing where the system is going, the system is going to degrade into the worst parts. So the worst patterns are going to come out if you're not directing it. And I mean, I've been at a bunch of companies where that's true. They don't have a handle on it, or they're blind to their culture. They don't know what their culture is.
I think that's closer to the truth, to be honest, because those kinds of companies don't acknowledge and accept the fact that organizations are organic. They're complex, adaptive systems, right?
They're groups of people.
That's right. Exactly. It's the human element that makes them unpredictable and non-prescriptive in a way. And you kind of figure it out as you go, as opposed to we'll do these things and it'll be fine.
Yeah. And every company has a culture.
Yeah.
It's just if you aren't cognizant of it, if you don't try to shape it in a positive way, it's going to kind of grow organically. It's just part of getting groups of people together is we just keep up and form our own dynamics.
So ignore it at your peril. Yeah. I agree.
Well, I want to keep digging because I want to go down the root, because we just came off a podcast of Taylorism is like the roots of modern management theory, like all of modern management theory basically, because American management theory anyway, because America basically ignored Deming, so like he doesn't really count in the management. He should, but he doesn't really count in the management theory. And I guess now things are kind of changing, especially when agility enters a career field. Things are, or into the field, things are kind of changing a little bit. But I also don't, because we will straight be. Like I said, I will talk until we're not going to run out of film. Like
that's a marathon podcast that's coming soon.
So, at what point did agility enter the picture in your career?
So it was a complete surprise, because it was this very short, like 3-month contract I had, where I was just dropped into a company. I was doing some systems analyst work there, and it was just happening around me, where I didn't know what it was. They weren't calling it out by name, but I noticed it was a very different way that they were working than what I was used to before. Like, they would have, I think the thing that probably stood out the most was they would have these, it took up most of the day. It was their end of sprint review. The entire company was invited. It was probably about 60 people. It was all the teams back to back, and they would talk about what they accomplished in the previous 2 weeks. And they just acted like it was perfectly normal. But to me, I was like, this is interesting. But it was nice to know what was going on throughout the company. And it was, again, I was just kind of dropped into it without any explanation, because I'm a contractor. I'm just in there to get a job done. And then when I got the job done, I was just plucked back out again. But it was it's a little eye-opening. Well, that was a curious sort of way of working. And it was actually in my very next job, where they were traditional waterfall, very old, established company, had been around for many decades. And shortly after I joined, they said, we're doing things too slowly. We want to go through a whole agile transformation. So then when they started talking about these concepts again, I'm like, oh, wait, that sounds familiar. I know it. Like, I recognize this. I know this. And so that got me really fired up about it, because I was like, oh, no, that was great. I thought it was a really good experience. So, the very first time I encountered it, I didn't really know what it was, because they didn't explain everything to me. It was just the way they worked. They didn't make a big thing out of it. But again, when I finally encountered it the next time, then it was like, sign me up. I want to be on the team that starts it. I want to be on that pilot team. And it was history ever since then.
That's amazing, because what I'm finding is people, when they go through a similar kind of curve, what they do is initially they feel like, what are these teams doing? For example, if you come from the traditional waterfall environment and you've been dropped in it, as you described it, the first thing that people grapple with is these teams are working for only 2 weeks at a time, and they don't have all of those requirements. So because you fall back to what you're best, and so people fight that internally, at least, right? They fight that and go, well, how are these teams muddling through in 2-week increments when they don't have all the requirements? Where are they? I want to see those. But it sounds like you approached it with an open mind, and you looked at the way they were delivering value to the organization, right, through that review that the whole company was invited at, and took that on board at your next gig, which is fantastic. Yeah. So I've struggled with that myself. Is when I first got into it, I went through a similar thing, but different in the sense that when they talk about backlogs, I'd expected that backlog to be completely fleshed out. Because I came from a waterfall environment.
Yeah.
And I'm looking for, being a project manager, I'm looking for sign-offs. Are the requirements signed off? Why are we even working on this stuff if it's moving, right?
Yep.
And so I struggled with that at that phase of my journey. And then I got trained in Agile, and my outlook completely changed.
Yeah.
You know, it's that you just do just enough and you discover along the way. It's that principle, we welcome changing requirements, even late in the process.
Yeah.
That didn't sit well with me at first, right? Because I thought, how will we know when we're done? The only way in my mind was when we have these very detailed, very elaborate requirements and signed off, and we'll deliver that, which I'd done for years prior to that as a traditional waterfall person.
Yeah.
But yeah, this was a very welcome, eye-opening change.
Yeah. And I had also done a lot of that project management, very traditional waterfall. And I also did a lot of client-facing projects, custom projects. And I saw time and time again that no matter how many conversations you had, how buttoned up the requirements were, there were always changes. Always. Unless it's the simplest, just color by dots, very simple, very easy sort of thing you're trying to do, there was always a change.
Yeah.
And so when I became more aware of what Agile was and what it was trying to accomplish, for me, it was like, well, that just makes sense. Like, because otherwise you're trying to be too perfect, and there's no way you can be perfect all the time.
For you guys. Oh man.
Tell us your trick.
Do you bring that in a product now? Like, hey, we're not going to be perfect, so like let's just start on something. Let's just get started on something.
Yeah,
like,
and it's a matter of you try something, you learn from it, you take that learning, you adjust, and you keep building, you keep refining.
I heard somebody explain that today, especially when they're part of a program. They're like, our team is trying things, and then some things work and some things don't, and other teams in our program are trying things, and now we're sharing we talked about this before. Like when you're part of a program, like at a large organization where you have many teams in your program. Let's say you have like, I don't know, eight teams in your program. I think that like some people will be like, bro, 8 teams, Brian, that's nothing. I've got 300 people in your program. No, you don't. I'm a little wake up call for you. Don't is when you're scaling with that many teams and everyone is retrospecting like what their mistakes were or what they could be doing better or whatever. Ideally, you will be learning from the other people's best practices. So now it's like you're multiplying the mistakes that you have made and learned from over the whole program. When you're doing it right, unless you're doing retrospectives, but in reality, it's like you are punished for making mistakes.
You're just checking a box.
Yeah.
No,
we're not.
True.
We're not showing my bias for what I want to talk about. We already were kind of on this topic about like what really clicks. You know what I mean? What you've taken to becoming passionate about in agility.
I found what really clicks with me is looking at it from the perspective of teams. Creating really empowered teams that are healthy and mature. And I mean, I have seen some amazing things done by teams that had a lot of trust, very cooperative, very helpful. Again, just creating a space where teams can be like that, it's amazing. Like, and I've also seen teams go through the transformation where literally they were just kind of working in their own little tasks and effectively they could have been individual contributors.
Right, yeah.
The team was just, it was in a name alone. And then, like, over time, as they started to work together and they started to really support each other and to combine their superpowers, that's really where you get the great effects. They're more than just the sum of their parts.
What are the signs that that's happening? The reason I asked that is because I had at a client that I was at as a contractor or a consultant, whatever. I told him that it was going to happen. I was like, I'll embed with your teams. And I'll set up your product, and I'll be like, you talk to me, don't talk to the teams. Talk to me about like when stuff's going to be done, and yell at me or whatever. Don't yell at teams. And once I cut that off, and there was no more negativity impacting the teams from the business, and it was only directly to me, so it wasn't a good thing. I told him, you will know when your team has got to the next level, because now they will start contributing ideas to your product. I was like, because that just wasn't happening. The team was just like, they were being quiet, and they were told what to do, and then they'd go do it, and then sometimes they wouldn't turn in exactly what the business wanted, so they'd take it in the next sprint, and back and forth, and they never got any ideas from the team members. I was like, these guys know exactly how your product works in every single detail. I was like, why are you not eliciting any requirements from your team members? Just because that just wasn't the environment. The feeling that they could create and contribute to the product roadmap just wasn't there.
Yeah.
And that was the first time I was like, when you see this happening, your culture's changing. And I sure enough pointed it out as soon as I saw it happen. I'm like, did you guys see that? Did you guys see that?
Yeah, and I'd say it's not just the usual outspoken ones doing that, but even the quieter team members contributing and giving those ideas. That for me is the real test, because I know quite often you'll have at least one or two of the talkers on the team, and they'll typically try to influence a little here and there. But even when the quieter people, when they start really contributing, that's a good sign.
I think from a team level, yeah, it's a really good sign in that kind of, I won't say behavior, but that should be encouraged and nurtured. I found the same with teams, but I've also found with leadership that resistance with the mindset, right?
Oh, yeah.
So going in saying, look, this is not going to be perfect, I'm telling you now, but we'll learn from the mistakes, right? We'll inspect and adapt, go forward from there. And at some point, the product owner came on board, and he basically started to say the same thing and say, yeah, this is not 100%, but 80% is good enough. And lo and behold, in this particular organization, it was a large multinational, and the product owner and most of IT rolled up under the CFO.
Yeah.
So lo and behold, when in one of the meetings, he said, wait, did you just say 80% is good enough? Why am I then paying for the other 20%? And I thought, right? So I've had those kinds of
I would expect that from CFO.
pushes.
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, because they're geared that way,
Yeah.
right? So what we had to do is just
they're the
retract.
gang boss.
They are the gang boss. Exactly. That's right. And it takes time to get through. So the way we kind of tackled that in that specific instance, I'll never forget that, is to change the vocabulary. We changed the vocabulary that we were using in front of that C-level troop of people. Instead of talking about 80% is good enough, we would simply say we met our objectives. Right, for the sprint, we met them.
Yeah.
That's it. One of the objectives was to learn this sprint from whatever we're working on in that sprint. So whether that was a paragraph or it was a chapter, it didn't matter. We learned, and it was a checkbox. And they said nothing after that, right? But over a few months, they came around. Most of them did. Not all of them did that,
No.
but most of them came around and they said, "We're delivering better now than we were before."
Yep.
But you're talking about 6 months before even the first person will say, yeah, this is better now than it used to
I
be.
know.
Right?
Some of those diehards are never going to come around. They're never going to understand. This is one of the very early things that I did was I added learnings into the backlog as a category of work item, I'll put it. Because I wanted to say, in development, there are things that you have to do before you can be sure that you can take on some type of work item, whatever it is, right? I mean, I got to go vet out a new technology. I got to go do some spike work to figure out whatever. I wanted to say, okay, well, everything like that, I want to be able to capture it and say X percentage of our time, it's not really time, X percentage of our effort, basically, goes into learning things, whatever that learning is, right? Because on other teams, yes, you'll have that one guy in the organization that's like, why are you learning on my time? Why am I paying you to go to school or whatever? Which is an absolutely ludicrous outlook.
It's crazy.
You know what I mean? It sounds crazy to say out loud, but there's so many people I've encountered in corporate America that are like, oh, I'm not going to pay for I'm like, why? You don't want your team to improve? But actually, no, they'd rather go out and hire somebody who already has a skill set, who learned it on their own time, and then pay whatever 30% more for that person. Those are the companies that, oh boy, I'm like, this is, I don't know how much of this I'm going to leave. Those are the companies that they got budget for hiring, but they don't have budget to give people raises. Like that's those companies.
And they'll pay many times more. I mean, it's not just the increment of somebody who has the skill set. It's when they come in, now there's onboarding, they've got to learn. So
Yeah, they don't have time for any of that. Like none of that's baked into the budget. Like your first X number of weeks are not going to be. You're not really going to contribute. Like they don't figure that. They're like day one, you should be contributing 100%, full blast.
Yeah, exactly.
Things in Agile that aggravate you, or that people get wrong, or topics, or trends, or subjects that's what we're talking about now. We're talking about, even though I explained this today, and I think this is like another recurring thing on the podcast. It's like when you join an organization, you never really know where the little bubble of agility starts. This comes out of the product podcast that we did with Tricia, where we were talking about the engineers enter the bubble of agility too late. You had people over here come up with a bunch of requirements, and then they decided we were going to build feature X, Y, and Z, or sales was like, we got to have this feature, and it's got to be basically solution work, not knowing anything technical, and they've done it in phases, and they've sold it with a date. And now it enters your bubble of agility where you're like, oh, let me just take it. And it's like, cool, you do whatever you want with Agile as long as you deliver 100% of it by this arbitrary date.
Yeah.
So
it's the same old traditional until you get to the developers and they go, okay, go ahead and do Agile stuff. And then again, traditional, right?
That's my type of thing with this topic, is like when you're adopting any kind of agility in your organization, it needs to span the whole organization.
Yeah.
This is where when they don't understand what true business agility means, they just simply focus on the dev team. And then they focus on the metrics that are also vanity metrics, right?
Yeah.
So overall, as a business, you're not agile still.
You're right.
Maybe your dev team is going toward agility. And even if they reach that, you're still not agile as an organization, right?
Yeah.
You can't respond to changing conditions in the market, whatever it is, right? And so you still fall foul of the same things that you would have done had you not taken your dev team agile.
Yeah, they just see it as a little bit of the process, and they can just drop it in, and they don't see the whole system. They don't see the whole mindset behind it, the values that they really should be trying to live. And you can't just take it as a little chunk of process.
Right. I've been looking at company prospecti. What's the plural? Bunch of prospectuses. It's where they say what they're all about, what their values are, and all of that good stuff, right? And increasingly, I'm finding most of those incorporate language around business agility. They throw those terms in there. So it's we're adopting greater business agility. And then when you dig deeper, you're finding there's really nothing different they're doing. So why even say that? Because if you didn't say that, it wouldn't be an expectation. Now you're saying it. Now you're up there with the other runners that truly are. Even if they're not 100% there, they're on their way, right? But you're not actually doing anything toward that. So I'm finding that surprisingly, right? And I'm saying a lot of these companies are technical companies, like technology-based companies that say that.
Yeah,
right?
Or they just relabel what they're doing.
Yeah.
They're just using the new buzzwords.
I'll follow where you're going with this one, because that's what I run into a lot is we just relabel our project managers. Or worse is a project manager / Scrum Master in the job description, which, by the way, I have to say, the job descriptions out there, I think they're getting worse.
They are getting
They're
worse.
not getting, like, since we did our job description podcast, they're getting worse. So I see another job description, like current job roles out there. I see another one in our near future, like in the next probably 6 weeks. We should do another one. Just source with the jobs that are out there.
This is fresh in my mind because last night this came up as a topic.
Oh, really?
So, yeah.
Job descriptions?
Yeah. Job descriptions and what do we do? Like we're stuck, right? So we have to educate people, and it's hard to do.
Yeah. And I also find it's even harder because I've talked to HR people before, and they don't even understand the role, which makes it hard for them to know if it's a good job description. They're trying to get feedback from different people, and it's being written by committee, and they're copy pasting from other places, and that's why it's kind of Frankenstein together the way it quite often is. And it's never exactly what you're going to be doing. I find it's usually all the things that might theoretically be done, but the things you actually do might not even be there. What's interesting is when you get HR people who actually try to use a more agile approach toward recruiting, because there are a few groups out there like that. And it's very interesting because that opens up their eyes, that helps them to understand and do better recruiting for those types of roles, just because they're more familiar with it. They get it. They're doing it themselves in a way.
it's coming up now, agility in that field, agility in HR and marketing. I'm seeing more traction in those two areas.
I worked at an organization where one of the HR groups, in fact, the VP of HR, reached out to me because they were looking at their own internal reward system, how they do bonuses, things like that. And they said, hey, we want to do this in a more agile way. Traditionally, it was they come up with their own ideas as a group and write it up, call it a day, and the employees are all mad about it. But the thing was, I walked them through a process where they were getting feedback from people. They were really kind of brainstorming, iterating, taking that feedback, coming up with new concepts. And it was just so refreshing. And they loved it. That was the best part of all. They loved getting the feedback. They loved iterating through it and making improvements and knowing that what they were going to come up with, people, I mean, maybe not everyone would love it, but a lot of people would actually find it more valuable. They would find it more relevant to them. They would know they'd been part of the process. And so it was just fascinating the way, in that organization, those HR people just adored agility. It was quite refreshing.
I'd love to see some examples like that, success stories, if you will, from finance. That would be good. Maybe we can get a finance person in. That might be a taller order, but we'll try.
This is what happens when you dig your way out of the right-handed ditch and then you land in the left-handed ditch.
So I'm digging to fill the other ditch and then dig it again. That's what I'm doing.
Guardrails on the whole podcast are completely off right now. None of them are working. I don't know. What else? I'm opening the floor. What can we fix? Actually, this segues right into the second category, which is what is the next iteration of Agile? Agile 2.0. Snap your fingers and fix something in Agile that's broken.
So what does the next Agile look like? Agile 2.0 or whatever you want to call it?
Yeah, or maybe it doesn't need to have people pay attention to the principles and the values and
getting back to the basics, to the core principles, not getting hung up on the jargon and labels, but really thinking about the core ideas, the mindset, the values behind it, because it's things like values that drive behavior. That's what drive actions.
What are your thoughts on, to that end, the whole Heart of Agile initiative, where everything's basically boiled down into 4 things? What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's elegant. It's the simplicity. You don't have to have a lot of flowery language about it.
That's true.
It distills it. It makes it so that everyone can very clearly see it, understand it, communicate it.
I like the fact that it fits on a pin or a badge, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's as summarized as you can get it. So that's fantastic. Yeah. In your mind, what are some of the things that you might change if you were to rewrite the manifesto to bring it current? Because it has been a while. Right?
Yeah.
And so
So
I doubt that the original authors would go back and update it for various reasons. Well, we're not going there today, but
we're definitely keeping it on its 1999 web server.
and it is now old enough to drink, even in the U.S.
Man.
It's true. It is.
Signed February 2001.
PHP 1.0. No, whatever it was. Yeah. So how would you change that to kind of make it more aligned or suitable to reflect today's work environment? Because one of the things that has changed in all that time is the cycle of discovery. The knowledge cycle has really compressed. If you take your time like you used to do, not even that far back, maybe half that. If you're binary chop, half that, right? That's too long today. Your competitors will eat you for your lunch. So you've got to move fast. And so to me, it's worthwhile looking at what can we change, but I'm not sure what that might be, to be honest.
I think one thing it's really missing is different perspectives. It was written by 17 white male developers. It's literally the manifesto.
Yes.
It's and what's really sad is, specifically in software, other minorities have been underrepresented. But even back in that day, there were people they could have invited. People who were well known in the software industry, who were influencers, thought leaders. And it's funny because there's one that came to mind. So Rebecca Werfs-Brock she came to mind because I bumped into her at an Agile conference a few years ago. And my husband was with me at the time. And he turned into a complete fanboy because, well, she is known for being literally writing the book on object-oriented software design. Mm-hmm. And he studied in the book that she wrote. And when he recognized her on site, he asked her to sign his laptop. Like, it was, it was a little embarrassing, but and again, she wrote that book back in the mid-90s. She was well known. Even someone like her could have been invited just to give a different perspective. And I think that's one thing that really could be introduced today is getting people's different views and not making it as software centered. And granted, because they were all software developers, that's their lens. Yeah. That's what they're focused on. So I totally understand that at the time. But definitely think it could be more broadly interpreted. I know a lot of other individuals have tried to reinterpret it over the years, but that's really where I see there being a few opportunities is reinterpreting it, not leaving it chiseled in stone, and looking at it through different perspectives and not just software.
Yeah, I agree. I think that phrase where it says we find better ways to build software. So the focus back then was software, but it's being adopted in all sorts of other places now. So maybe some reframing is needed there. Absolutely.
And I know when I've trained organizations, or even just working with some of those HR people, when they look at it and they see software, they're like, we're not building software. Yeah. And it makes it a little harder for them to relate to. But they're like, well, does that apply to me and what I'm doing?
Right. Am I a developer, right? Because it talks about developers. So no, I've had that conversation with leadership when they look at that and they say, how does this apply to us? We're leaders. Developers are those pointy heads over there. No, you're all developers. We're develop the work. That's why. We're not crafting code, but we're developing the work. We're taking it forward. We're progressing it. That makes us all developers. You're kind of coming at it from a defensive posture at that point, and you're because of that language, largely, right? So
you're translating it. You're trying to make it apply, make sense, make it more general.
You said to solicit input other than just software or just development, or certainly being more inclusive with different minorities. What about functional areas? Representation from testers, representation from business analysts. What do you think about that? Because all of these things play into it. Whether you're building software or not, you still have people that are validating. So it's not necessarily running automated tests, but validating the product, whatever the product is. Well, you have people that are engaged in the requirements side of things. So,
Well, I know for a fact that because I've heard a few people say that they did invite women to the conference. It's just none of them showed up. Now I'm not going to defend that statement because I don't know what that means. There's a lot of parties I could invite a lot of different people to, and it's pretty much implied that they really shouldn't. It's not in their best interest to show up. Like I might be a tester, and if I'm the only tester in the room, showing up to a bunch of developers complaining about how testers are terrible. Like maybe I don't want to just spend the whole weekend in a ski lodge getting yelled at by a bunch of developers, or maybe I don't want to climb that mountain of trying to change all these people's opinions. Like that's why I don't want to be a Scrum Master anymore. I'm real tired of like in product when I say I need something or we won't progress until we change whatever XYZ about the business. Even if it's a cultural thing about the business, leadership will basically drop what they're doing and put some thought or effort into changing whatever. And then when I'm a Scrum Master and I say the same thing, then I got to fill out some reports and I got to pull some metrics together and I got to get the tech leads together to get their opinion and build some consensus. But I have researched this a bit as well. It's like the BAs, testers, project managers, all those, like they were trying to cut those people out. That's why those people likely did not show up or weren't invited. I don't really know that. Honestly, I don't really know. But I know for a fact they were trying to cut BAs out because I've heard somebody directly say, we didn't need BAs. We didn't want somebody interpreting requirements. We wanted to talk directly to customers and get requirements. I do have strong feelings about that statement, but I'll leave that alone for right now. I just wanted to add that context.
No, I certainly can see the other side of it. Even before working in Agile, I'd had developers meet with customers, and it was the annual user conference. So the first day was just listening to the customers complain, because that's part of it, noting everything that they talk about. And then the next day, it's a 2-day conference in some nice location. The next day, the company got to show off some of their newer products. And the gap there was, well, nobody asked them what they want, but we built something and here it is, right? So the developers are there, and of course, inevitably people talk. And the customer says, well, wouldn't it be nice if we could do this? And the developer almost takes it on as a challenge, and they'd say, oh, sure, we can do that. And now it became a promise. So, because I'm across the table as a PM at the time, but hey, listen, if you say you can do that, what they're hearing is you will do that.
Right.
Yes.
For them.
Right.
Right. So I would put a lid on that because that was my job. It's control scope, right? Control cost. And now it's turned on its head. Now it's like, well, if we did this, would this be of value? What else would you like?
Yeah.
Right. And if they say that, well, we'll get back to you. But yeah, that's great. Thanks for the feedback. So that's been my own like personal transformation, whatever you call it.
Well, it's funny because now we're back in the same space where instead of the project manager blocking and tackling, now the product people are blocking and tackling and trying to developers aren't good in front of people. Ooh, if you let the developers talk to people, they'll commit to stuff and they'll get themselves underwater. Like now, you know what I mean? I see product people trying to do the same thing that project managers were trying to do back in the day. I don't know if it's good or bad, but I do see that.
I think it's part and parcel of the reason why product managers and project managers are getting confused with each other as roles from people that don't understand it, from the outside looking in, right?
I don't understand it.
You're from the inside looking out. You don't understand it. What else can we change about being agile?
I think it was a point we brought up a little bit earlier where really we should be looking at the organization as a whole system.
Yeah.
Where you can't just try to change a little part and expect it to work perfectly you really have to look at the whole thing.
Ironically, that's part of Agile now. We talk about optimizing the whole, getting away from local optimization. And yet in practice, that's really what's going on from an organizational perspective, right? There's little pockets of agility, but then there are these huge swaths of non-agility.
This is already one that I've kind of been thinking of as a podcast. Like I'm gonna lean in a little closer, like it's a secret. This is kind of one that I've already been thinking about, which is when you're trying to avoid that bubble of agility that we were talking about. Usually when agility enters a company, it's entering inside of the Trojan horse of Scrum, right? And it's entering with a team or two or maybe some development teams or whatever. But the real thing that should be entering should be agility, and then whatever framework follows that, right? That is not the way that most people that I have worked with have adopted it. It's one of their development teams or somebody, some executive or somebody, you know what I mean? Like says, oh, we got to go agile or whatever. But most of the time, it's been grassroots up. Somebody starts changing, and then someone gets wind of it, and then maybe it catches up.
It's not a strategic direction from the very top. It's very rare.
It starts with a model. And then it tries to work backwards from there. And I think that's a whole podcast of its own to be like, what? How did it get like this? You know what I mean? And why is like all the conversation of agility? Why is that wrapped up with Scrum? There should be some way to bring agility into a company without bringing your framework into a company. Like I would think that Kanban would be a simpler introduction of agility. Like think about it. This is what I'll say to actually bring this back into relevance. The executive team at any company, the C-suite at any company, they operate as an executive Kanban. They all do. Even if they don't write it down or actually have a physical board somewhere or whatever, electronic board. They all work on stuff that is the most burning thing. They usually have more than one thing in the air at a time, but they can only work on one or two things at a time, and then they have a backlog of like stuff they know they got to get to, but they're not going to get, you know what I mean? Stuff that they're waiting on other people, so stuff that's blocked, stuff that they're bottlenecking for other teams. They all have that, but very few of them visualize it so that people can tell them and track work in progress and track the delay time and getting things through, you know what I mean? Stuff like that, just basic concepts of Kanban. And usually companies like that, they have teams doing Scrum, and then transitioning teams from Scrum to Kanban is seen as like a more advanced step doing software development, because it's like, well, you really got to have your stuff down, you got to have your backlog kicked in, you got to have your product online, you know what I mean? Your team has to know how to vet items. I mean, writing items and breaking them down should be a thing. And then Kanban is like a more advanced flow from getting started with Scrum. And I'm just trying to think of like, well, you all have the executives doing what you think is the most advanced. They're just doing it in complete chaos without writing anything down.
Yeah.
So, like, can we start there? Like, would that be the way to go into companies and be like, let me put somebody up at the leadership level. Just visualize what you guys are doing. Just visualize it. Don't change anything about what you're doing. Oh, it's too hard to write cards. I'll do that for you.
Right.
Right. Just 10 minutes in the morning, get it all worked out. I'll move the stuff, do it for you. And that's not even a full-time job doing that right there.
If you did that successfully, you'd be instilling that lean mindset at the very beginning,
Right,
at the very top of the hierarchy. Because that's the other thing we talk about in one of the other podcasts, is the hierarchies and how things morph.
Right, yeah.
But yeah, definitely strong leadership, and at the very top C-suite, whatever leadership looks like at an organization, if they were thinking more in a lean manner, right, then they would get more done, but they don't know that. So they got to be coached by somebody, right?
Yeah.
So they need a sidekick, is all I'm saying. Just like the teams need to be coached by a Scrum Master, these guys too need a sidekick.
Yeah, a lot of people don't reflect on how they do things. They just have always done things a certain way. So being able to take that step back and say, okay, I'm going to write down what I'm doing. I'm going to look at it. I'm going to visualize it. It's just not what they're used to. They're just used to their habits, their patterns. So trying to break them out of it and make it a more conscious thing. How do we work? Why do we work this way? It's just not something people do every day.
Yeah. I think that's the proper entrance to agility in a company, is right at the top, just to say, look, I'm not trying to change the way you work. I just want to visualize it first. And then once you see it, you will start realizing, VP of a VP of everyone only has 2-3 work items in progress, but VP operations has 50. Like, something is wrong. Okay, once and that would take you literally whatever it took to stand up the system to realize something is wrong. Because if things are not visualized, how do you at a leadership level know something is wrong? I mean, you're right. Yeah, I mean, it's like the absolute bare bones basics of the lean startup. You know what I mean? It's like, read the book and like all this is completely should be apparent. This turned into my frustrations rather than your frustration. I'm so sorry.
Okay.
Welcome to the podcast. The final thing with this topic is I had the thing that I keep coming back to where I'm like, every Scrum Master, you can say Agile coach too, it doesn't really matter. Every Scrum Master, like, you have your teams, your development teams, but then you also have the leadership team. You have to work for them. They're your shadow team, you're your other team, so you're N+1 teams. Because if you're not arranging them, of course they're sabotaging your stuff. You need to help them do whatever your team is doing if nobody's doing that for them.
I mean, it's certainly valid to say that a Scrum Master isn't just focused on their team. They also need to be coaching the organization. The Scrum Guide specifies that now. And they need to be coaching the product owner as well, if they're not already of the lean thinking mindset, right? Or agile mindset, I should say. But very few Scrum Masters actually do this.
Yeah.
Because their focus is largely team-based, right?
Yeah, well, they're contained in development, and like that would be, if we're talking about like next level agile or whatever, agile 3.0, I don't know what it would be. I have no idea. That would be my contribution, because all the organizational management, all the change management, organizational psychology, none of that is in development. None of that's in the technology department. None of the people in the technology department. Maybe somebody has a degree in organizational psychology. Maybe. Usually not in my experience. No. But all the skill for that, it's there somewhere in the organization. It's probably not in technology. The change here that we're talking about is encompassing the entire organization, rather than saying like, wow, we're just gonna how we build the products or whatever. Like, how you build the products is going to be heavily influenced by all the stuff that comes before you and above you, whatever you want. I don't know a good way to say it in the organization.
Exactly. I mean, it's all the things that lead into that part of the little agile bubble. Yeah. Do you have the financing you need to be able to do things in small delivery cycles? Yeah. Do you have the goals, that vision, that direction being shared with those teams so that then they can keep moving toward that? It's really looking at the whole system.
You've got the finances to do things as you need in January through June, and then and then and then in the later parts of the year, when the budgeting starts coming to around October, when it starts looking like you're running out of money, suddenly You
Gotta
need
go back to the well.
all the requirements up front and all the design up front
Right.
and all the yeah. Oh man, got to fire all your teams and spin them all back up in January, second week of January.
And
Yep.
then you'll have illusion of success.
That's right. That's
Yeah.
right.
It all depends on how you define it.
It's right, exactly.
Like I said, when we started or before we started, I don't remember. I have no memory of these at this point. Like one of the reasons I started doing the podcast is because I wanted to sit down with people that either I worked with or were in the field or I interacted with up until this point. Because I was like, at some point in time, I will look back and I'll be like, man, what advice would I give myself? Even when I look back at the early podcasts, like, man, I have some advice for myself a year ago about doing the podcast.
So to that end, what advice would you give to yourself or others, really?
Yeah.
Or others,
Yeah.
Yeah, for me, and my career is a great example of it. I always am inspecting and adjusting. I believe we pull in that whole Kanban idea: plan, do, check, adjust.
Mm-hmm.
And that's good for your career, for your life. It's because that way I'm always growing, I'm always evolving, I'm finding what's really giving me value, making me happy, what's fulfilling me. In fact, recently I read a book called Designing Your Life, where it takes a very design thinking approach to not just a career, but your entire life. And that's really what I've been doing without realizing it throughout my life as I'm, evolving my career, where I live, who I surround myself with, what I'm doing as hobbies. Like that's something that's evolved and changed over time. So I'd say keep learning, keep changing, keep just evolving and just growing as a person.
What else can you do, right? Because your career spans over several decades and you really don't know where you're going to go. You just know where you are, and you may have a vision about 2 years out or 5 years out maybe. But then beyond that,
The world's changing.
yes, exactly. What about yourself? What advice would you give yourself, Brian?
Me?
Yeah, I don't have a tie, but I can be Brian.
I had a mind change when I read the Carol Dweck mindset book, because that's the book that talks about the fixed mindset versus growth mindset, and everyone else just kind of uses it as buzzwords. But if you actually read the book, like it does a lot to change your kind of how you look at things, kind of your viewpoint. It was a big change for me because I realized that there was a lot of things that I was doing that I was not happy with, but I couldn't quite understand why. And when I read the book, I was like, I get it now.
Yeah, it's how you frame it, how you think about it. It makes all the difference.
It's also like I have this very negative self-talk that doesn't help me at all through life, and that's part of the mindset book is you expect to be successful the first time you do something, you know what I mean, or you try to hide or diminish any kind of failure in any way, shape, or form, rather than learning from it. And that's all hallmarks of the fixed mindset. And I've worked with tons of people that are very, very stuck in it. Like most of the fear-based managers and stuff I work with are stuck in the fear mindset. And I wish I had read that book earlier in my career, because not just for myself, but it would have enabled me to realize that I'm stuck under managers or stuck in programs with people that, people that run the programs that are just, they're never going to change. And there's no motivation for them to change in the program. So just get away from people like that. I don't know if that's good advice, but
it is, and it's also good to be aware that you can focus on yourself and you can change yourself, but you can't expect anyone else to change.
You're right. Yeah.
If they happen to change and they think that's a good thing for them, fantastic. But ultimately, you kind of control yourself and the way you embrace the world and what you do, how you respond to it. You have more control over it than sometimes you feel like you do. And again, you kind of take control of that and understand that the rest of the world, you can try to influence it, but ultimately everyone's living their own lives.
Are you telling me you can't coach people that don't want to be coached? Is that, you guys trying to tell me that?
I give it a good. I give it a good heave-ho and then say, okay, good luck.
Sometimes
want it,
they have
right?
to find it on their own.
Yeah.
They have to be open to it.
Is that what I've been doing wrong all these years?
I know. I just need to get different pair of chopsticks, as Mr. Miyagi would say.
Oh, no.
No.
Are there any people that you can think of that had a big influence on you throughout your career that come to mind? I feel like we don't spend enough time on the podcast generally talking about the people that have influenced us. Like when we delved into Om's career a couple podcasts back, he talked about a few colorful characters and jumping down manholes in his suit.
In my formative years, professionally speaking, right? Right out of college. But yeah. So, but that wasn't. I don't think that was at the beginning of my Agile journey as such. It was just my work life, really. It was my first job. Didn't know what to expect. I had this degree. That was about it. What do you do with that now? Right?
Jump down manholes and suits.
Jump down manholes. Go up poles.
Yeah.
Fix
suits.
things.
I like it.
Yeah. It just goes to show you how I just had that blinkered view of work was. Again, this was in the UK years ago. And you always went to work professionally, at least with a suit on. So that's what I did. Yeah. And my first day at work, the workers basically they laughed at me, and they said, "Well, all right, hey, this is this guy from HQ." No. So this is what we're gonna do. It was pouring rain, and they opened up a manhole cover. It's full of filthy water, and they said, "Well, we're gonna go down there and find a wire that's not working with the telecommunications and fix it." But there's a lesson learned. Say, figure out your environment, dress accordingly. Who knew? But that guy who ended up being my boss for 2 years at my first job, he heavily influenced my outlook on corporate business and work life. But what about yourself?
Yeah. For me, I'd have to say it was that first team, that Agile team I worked with, where we went through that whole transformation together throughout the entire organization, because that was the first time I'd really worked with a team where we were very, very trusting, very high performing. We became a very mature team over that time. And that experience was amazing. Like, there was such camaraderie. We really had each other's backs. We were always helping each other. It was just such a positive experience. And that just really makes the job a wonderful thing. Even if you're up against crazy challenges, like if you're doing it with a group like that, it doesn't matter as much if the work's hard because you're doing it all together. And it makes it so much more rewarding. And that's what I'm always trying to seek, is that type of environment, that type of team that can be built up like that and really gel and really just make it a good place to work.
Have you had that success repeated over time? So that's it. For me, it's the biggest challenge is just keeping a team intact. Just when they escape out of forming, somebody leaves, somebody else joins, and right back down again we go. And it's nothing you can control.
Yeah, and
usually
that's always part of the challenge, is that is outside of your control. But it's something that I've had it happen a few times, and it's just been so wonderful. That's the sort of place where it's like I want to go back to work every day because I'm working almost with friends. And I mean, people like that from that first team, I'm still in touch with a lot of them. And pre-pandemic, we used to go out to lunch occasionally and just keep in touch and just And then when we get together, it was just like old times, just like we were back working together.
It's rare. I don't have that. Yeah. It's probably also a function of me moving around so much. But even without that, my teams are always in a state of flux, and that's always a difficult thing. Especially when you have leadership teams that it takes longer, in my opinion, it takes longer to get to that place of trust with leadership, because usually they view you through the lens of change. This guy's telling me all these things. It's risky. I know what I do. I've done it for years. It works. At least I think it works. And this guy's saying do it differently. Yeah. So it takes time. And eventually, just you start winning their trust, somebody leaves, somebody else comes in, and you start all over again. And usually those people that are resisting change will accelerate their resistance, because somebody new comes in and they're now in alliance with this new guy. Yeah, we really don't need all that stuff. So it makes your job so much harder. So if you can have that, whether it's a dev team or whatever team, that is incredible. I just don't know what you can do to kind of to land in that spot, basically, right?
What I find is if it's modest change, like sometimes someone new will join, in which case you just have to kind of adopt the person, get them familiar with the team, kind of bring them in, get them used to the team culture, the way we interact, just the team dynamics. Like I've been on teams where we did bring in new people, and they kind of became part of that team, and it was all part of that magic. But again, if there's heavy disruptions, lots of people leaving, lots of people joining, I agree, it's so hard to kind of keep that culture, keep that camaraderie, that same feel. if there is too much change. And with so much flux right now, it's hard to do, but when it happens, it's just beautiful.
Magical, really. Yeah, I agree. Absolutely.
It's like, that's the sort of thing that I live for. I love trying to get to that place.
Is this the first team from your Interest to Agility story, or is this a different team?
Well, that's the team I think back to where we kept it going the longest.
Yeah.
And I have had other teams where it was just like spending time with old friends where we really understood each other. We weren't afraid to challenge each other, call each other out. I mean, we did it all it was a positive reason. We weren't being negative about it. It was constructive. Mm-hmm. But again, it was something where everyone was generally good with it. And it's when we can get to that point in the team development, it's wonderful.
Were you a Scrum Master or a BA or Agile Coach, or what were you doing?
I have been the product owner on one, Scrum Master, Agile Coach on another. So even from different perspectives, it wasn't just because I was in a certain role. It was just kind of building up that trust and finding ways of being open and getting to know each other.
Yeah.
I find that's actually part of the challenge, especially with a lot of remote work, because I work with a fully remote team, is getting to know everyone on the team and building up that trust as a result, and knowing ways you can joke around with each other and still have it be a good thing and no one takes it personally. So as I said, just getting to know the team members, it's much trickier in a fully remote environment.
The only reason I asked that because I'm wondering, I definitely have an opinion, surprise, about forming trust with a team when you're a Scrum Master or an Agile Coach and when you're a product person. I think it's a completely different way of going about forming trust with a team. I wonder if you have a different opinion.
I say, it would be different because the team would be looking at each role differently.
Yeah.
Because the product owner should be that little CEO of the product. They should be providing the vision, the leadership, like someone to look to get that guidance. Whereas if I'm as a Scrum Master or Agile Coach, it's less around that sort of forward vision and guidance and more around how can we find better ways to work together and how can we collaborate. As I said, just finding better ways, removing impediments. So kind of looking at it almost from more of a process perspective of interacting. So again, I'm sure that the team members would look at it differently depending on the role.
Yeah. Thank you for going down that road, so I didn't have to, because sometimes meaning all the times, I get sick of hearing myself talk on the podcast. No, I have the exact same opinion. The Scrum Master's job is to make sure that the system that the team is working in is not poison. Number one, right, and number two, that the system is actually helpful to what the team is doing. All right, and then over time, it becomes a place where everyone actually enjoys showing up to. Product manager, on the other hand, completely a whole different set of first of all, don't be too domineering. Stop asking people how long is that going to take? Don't be a project manager. I think that's what I'm saying now.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely agree. Right, depending on the role, the way you obtain trust and the way you foster that relationships, at least, right, that varies. A Scrum Master very much is equal in the team. You're part of the team. You're there with them every day. Ideally, as a product person, you should be, as much as possible anyway. But in many organizations, one of the symptoms are the product owner is not dedicated, and that's a big red flag. So consequently, they cannot spend enough time with the team, which dings your ability to win that trust. Yeah. I think you have to take a different viewpoint based on the role you're playing.
The logical place to take this conversation is the place that we've gone many times, which is companies that are I'll just have my developers play the role.
Oh, play the role.
Play the role.
Yeah.
But what you get is somebody who does it part-time, and they're not invested in it. They're not going to go research organizational psychology. They're not going to, in their free time, they're not going to go to the leadership team and try to make allies and try to build relationships and try to put people together. And
it's not their forte to begin with, but this is a great conversation. And actually, it's a pretty easy conversation to have with leadership when they say, play the roles. That fair enough, Mr. CEO or CFO or whatever, right? Today you're a CMO, you're a chief marketing officer. Play the role.
Yeah.
And see how that goes,
Yeah.
right? And that's a short, easy conversation because they will
Yep.
understand
Yeah.
what you mean when you phrase it that way.
It depends on who you talk to, because I'm like, if you're talking to the CEO, especially if they're a founder of a company, they're used to playing many roles.
If they're founder of the company,
But-
they really,
But at least somebody in that role will understand. Like we said, role too many times. Somebody in that role will at least understand when I'm doing this over here, all this other stuff's getting neglected.
That's right.
And they will completely understand that. So I don't know what you. Again, this is the nice thing about being in product and why I'm never going back, because at least in product I can be like, this is the stuff that has to happen, and that's it. So it's black and white coming from product. When it's coming from someone who's trying to arrange your processes and stuff like that, then there's wiggle room. We can talk about it. We can negotiate. But again, the lean startup makes a point that says most companies that come up, they just let the chaos happen, and they're like, we're getting to what needs to get done. It's chaos. It's okay. But in the lean startup, the author goes out of his way. I can't remember his name right now. The author goes out of his way to say, he's like, no, you should define all the processes when you're small, because and anything else that crops up that's chaos outside of that, you should bring that into the process and make a process for it. He's like, because then when your company gets bigger, like, you can't scale chaos.
Yeah.
So from that perspective, bringing the Scrum Master in and letting them let the executive team understand how they actually are working, and then visualize the work so that they have some kind of boundaries around what they're doing, and then making sure that every other team has some kind of process and is not just absolute chaos. That's a super important job.
I agree. I think it was Eric Ries.
Eric Ries, that's right. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, that's a very valid point. A lot of organizations start small and have early success, and then they look at that and go, well, why mess with what's working, right? Chaos worked for us. Well, yeah, you muddled through it, but now you're scaling. And if you're scaling, your point is absolutely spot on.
It's like every technical lead I've ever worked with, that like their developers are working like 40, 45, 48, whatever hours, and then the tech leads, development leads, whatever, are like 60 hours minimum. Okay, because the tech leads are not on any one team. They kind of span the teams, or maybe they're in whatever departments, whatever it is. But they are working on some kind of tech lead Kanban, the things that kind of float between teams or things out of the backlog. But they don't have it visualized anywhere, so they're just burning the midnight oil, working on everything. Basically, they're doing leadership level stuff, just like I was talking about a leadership team, except now they're doing it in between teams, and they don't have a Scrum Master because nobody assigns a Scrum Master to. So, like, again, it's like if you're a Scrum Master on a team, and we're not a small company, you're not going to work at the CEO level, but you can come up immediately above your teams to work at like the leads level and pull all the cross-functional leads together. And maybe you can work with them. So I don't even know what this has nothing to do with the podcast topic that we started with, but I'm glad we're here.
I'm glad we're here too, and I actually agree with that. A Scrum Master's role is to look up and say, let's coach that too, right? And even leadership, really, because they're supposed to be coaching the organization.
Yeah,
what does that mean?
But that is
It's
your
people.
leadership.
Yeah.
I mean, that's
Right.
your leadership in your little tiny corner of the organization.
And I think that's part of the problem, is even for Scrum Masters who do feel comfortable to coach, they might not have access to senior leadership, depending on how many layers are in between.
It's by organizational design, by the way. Yeah. You gotta climb up out of that and overcome that somehow. I don't.
Just reach that escape velocity.
I don't, because I'm in product. I'm just like, oh, red flag. Oh my God, a red flag. We got to do something.
Well, let's put a cap in this by
Always.
simply just covering what's next for you. Like, where do you see your career going next? Where would you like it to go?
Do you want to get into podcasting? That's what we're asking.
That's right.
For me, it's, again, just kind of continuing the journey. I'm back into product ownership, so I'm looking to see what difference I can make in the world, making things more accessible, technology more accessible, which is a fantastic mission. So I'm going to go along that journey for a while, and I'll inspect and adapt, and we'll see where the road leads.
Fantastic. Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. We really enjoyed having you here.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Appreciate it. Yeah. Well, thank you for the two of you that stayed with us thus far. Subscribe and smash that like button down below. It's that button, but down there.
Whoa, what hand sign are you giving? Oh, okay. I didn't.
That one.
I only saw it out of the corner of my eye, so it could have been any finger.